Hi, I'm Brendan Crosdale, and welcome to the LAN Party. I'm here today with the chapter master of the Golden Reapers, Mike
Yes,
McLaughlin.
you are.
I'm also here with the reclusiarch of the West End, James Lowry.
We get to talk about 40K!
If you guys have any idea what those two things are, you probably know about a game called Warhammer 40K. I don't, but I have two friends who are incredibly enthusiastic about it, to a point that if I mention the game, I'm inundated with a vernacular language associated with it that makes little to no sense to me.
It's not my fault you didn't read the Codex Astartes.
This is what I'm talking about. So here's the thing with me. So my understanding of 40K is entirely barren. I know almost nothing about any of the games that came out of Games Workshop. I know nothing about miniature gaming. The closest I ever got as a youth was playing Battletech, which is maybe little paper guys, not very hardcore at all. It's about robots. Yeah. So for the layman, the man who has no idea what's going on with Warhammer, because that could be a substantial population, what is this game?
In the grim, dark future of 40K, humanity's last hope is killing everything in a genocidal war from one end of the galaxy to the other. Prepare yourselves and your butts to clench in terror.
Wow.
But seriously, it's a really great multifaceted hobby that encompasses artistic and crafts talents of sculpting and painting, along with tactical and mathematical knowledge of how to maneuver an army through a battlefield.
So is it fair to say it started as a miniatures game?
It did.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
If we go all the way back, it started with Games Workshops and Citadel Miniatures, who back in the day had a magazine called White Dwarf, which they still run, which used to encompass many different wargaming and RPG aspects of different communities. Now it just focuses on their products because they make more money that way. But they created a game called Warhammer Fantasy Battles way back in ye day, and after that ran pretty successfully for a few years in the late 80s. They started with a little publication called Rogue Trader, where they introduced the world of Warhammer 40K. And the Imperium of Man, and the Orcs, and the Necrons, and the Old Ones, and the Eldar, and the Dark Eldar, and the Forces of Chaos, etc., 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 etc.
What my friend here is trying to say is that this goes about 38,000 years into the future and takes all the elements of high fantasy and blows them out into a complete and utter ridiculous epic scale.
It is like science fantasy to the most fucked up nth degree.
And the thing is that it almost seems like certain restrictions are put into place to create as much conflict as possible. If you think back to the large-scale artillery battles of World War II on the Eastern Front, and something hums in you like you were an artillery officer in a past life, this world is for you.
So now, mechanically with the game, one thing I've noticed is that you guys, including Nate as well, have very strong attachments to certain factions within the game.
Yes.
Now, this stems from the fact that you have to build your army if you want to play with it.
Literally, yeah, you have to.
So it's like a cash investment at that point.
It's a heady cash investment.
Right. So you build these things, and then you can take your uniquely crafted army, different from other people's, and you can kind of pit them against one another within the game's rules.
Yeah. So there's really 3 different major aspects of the hobby, burgeoning on a 4th. So the first, with collecting the miniatures, is assembling them and painting them. A lot of people do what's called kit bashing or conversions, something that I really, truly, absolutely love. And that's taking all these miniatures you have and making custom miniatures out of different parts so that, you have your own named individual, completely unlike anybody else's general on the battlefield, and crazy units and all kinds of flair that you can say, well, this is the lore that goes with these guys, and they have all these different factions that you can pull from or making your own within the framework of the game. The next would be actually playing the game. That's the second facet of the hobby, is taking all the miniatures on the board, and you don't actually have to paint them. You can just glue them together or proxy them, whatever, if you suck, or if you're like me and you suck at painting. And then you actually play the game, and it's an objective-based tabletop war game where you have a number of different play styles and a point system to make sure that both teams are balanced, and then a lot of other rules that go into what type of units you can have on the battlefield with other units at certain times. Although a lot of those rules they threw out to make it more simple and at the same time more epic. And then the third aspect is the lore itself, right, which encompasses over 100 novels by about a dozen different writers.
Wow.
Including what's called the Horus Heresy, which is takes place in the year 30,000, or the 30,000 or the 31st millennia, and then the lore covers 10,000 years to take what's currently canon, coming up to the year 41,000.
So it's like the Silmarillion with machine guns.
Yeah, it's a lot like that. And then the fourth aspect of the hobby is going into other forms of media with all the video games that they have around it that they've been making since the 90s.
Dawn of War, what is it, Space Hulk?
Space Hulk.
Fire Warrior.
Fire Warrior, that was a alright game. And they're actually making a new one. I don't remember its name right now, which is kind of embarrassing, but it doesn't matter. We have so much to talk about. We can just fill this up.
So, okay, for the layman looking at the lore here, from the outside, the thing that strikes me almost immediately every time I'm presented with anybody who's enthusiastic about Warhammer is, one, they're very invested in their factions. Like I said, they have like a group that they know inside and out that they've become in love with. But the second part of it that always hits me so hard is the scale. The utter enormity of this world and the fact that it constantly reinforces just how large the conflicts are. What's going on there? What is like the nugget version of the conflict you're entering into when you go into this world?
Okay, one thing that you have to understand is that you've got to think of it as our entire Milky Way galaxy.
Okay.
That's your playing field. As mind-bogglingly huge as it is, and every aspect of every race and every bit of lore just hammers home how large this galaxy that we inhabit is. And the thing is that no matter what faction you pick, you are going to be in conflict with pretty much every other faction and several others that kind of come along with the whole universe. For example, because we're going to be going back to the Imperium of Man a lot, is that you're in conflict with about 12 other different factions just on the big names. And this is an Imperium of Man that spans across 1 million different worlds. And still, we only take up a certain portion of the galaxy. We hold more real estate than most, but that doesn't really mean all that much considering everything that we have to go up against.
And additionally, it gets into interdimensional space, because a number of these factions work from within what's called the warp, which is part of their metaphysics in the game. And do you want to try to tackle explaining what the warp exactly is?
Okay, hold on. Major players in this first. The Imperium of Man, that's humanity?
Yeah, here, I'm pulling up the full list right now so I don't fuck this up, but I meant to give off... Hey, you gonna do this? Yeah, the Imperium of Man is humanity in the way distant future. And that encompasses actually many in-game factions. So there are 9 loyalist Space Marine... legions, which then broke down after the Horus Heresy, which is okay. I know I'm throwing a lot of weird terms of everybody, but whatever.
Actually, let's just hit the species first.
Well, here, I've got the full list pulled up, so I'm going to start alphabetically. So for part of the Imperium of Man is the Adeptus Sororitas, which is the all-lady army of space nun battle warriors from the future, and they've been almost squatted out of existence because Games Workshop is run by a bunch of misogynistic asshole pieces of shit.
Shout out Games Workshop.
Yeah, hey, fuck you guys. Update Adeptus Sororitas so I can buy some reasonably priced models, you fucks. Okay, moving down the list, we get to what's called the Astra Militarum, which is bullshit because everybody knows it's the I Guard, which is the old name. They're the Imperial Guard. Used to be the faction's name, but they wanted to, sound more spacey because they're a bunch of pricks. And they're the losers. They suck. They do. They're the common man.
Do we know an iGuard player?
Yeah, there might be a little bit of that being tossed my way.
Yes. Ah, okay.
So they represent like the non-super soldier common people who are pretty much just pushed by the machines of war to like make mountains of corpses and rivers of blood for enemies to drown and be suffocated under. They serve no other purpose, and they're terrible. Okay. So moving down the list, then we get to the best faction in the game.
I'll get you for that, Michael.
My faction, the Blood Angels, descended from their progenitor Sanguinius, one of the most loyal of all the 20 Space Marine Primarchs. They are especially accented as Space Marine chapters for 2 reasons. Well, really 3. Their highlights, number 1, jump infantry, which for those who don't know, means that like half their army is just kitted out with jetpacks the size of like, I don't know, like a table, like a full-size dinner table that they wear on the backs of their giant armor and then blast across the battlefield at high speeds. They also have, like, the best vehicles in the entirety of the Imperium because they're awesome. And then on top of that, they have what people call a flaw in their gene seed, what I call making the best units in the game, the Death Company, where occasionally, it just kind of happens that they go psychotic and decide to kill everything around them. So what you do is you bound them into machines, right? And you keep them like chained up. And then when the battle starts, you just drop them in the middle of the enemy ranks and they kill them all. And, maybe they die, and if they don't, you collect them back up, put them back in prison, and repeat the process until they're dead. Because that's what they deserve, and that's an honorable death.
So only 4 factions into this. I'm getting a feeling that once we get to the super future, things are not going so well for the development of man anymore.
Oh, no, yeah. Humanity has fallen on hard times. By hard times, I mean we rock, but we're super evil. We're, arguably, there are no good guys in 40K.
Okay.
The Imperium of Man is this fascist, theocratic ultra regime that just heals all sedition, or crushes all sedition under its heels.
So now these factions are competitive with one another, but as a race, are we?
So, all right.
If you don't mind, I mean, also, we have a great illustration here of an Astartes player, passionate, very, very, very enthusiastic about it.
It just helps to know that you're playing the right army.
And this is one of these things that I can tell you is that if you encounter an Astartes player, just don't argue with them. They are full of passion for the God Emperor, and that's as it should be.
But here, I'll finish off with our list of at least the Imperium forces.
Okay.
So then going back down the list, we get to the Grey Knights, also known as the 666 chapter, who were created with a new gene seed by the God Emperor after his fall and the Siege of Terror and his end battle with Horus, and he was then trapped into the Golden Throne, etc., etc. And they're crazy super inquisitors in what's called Terminator armor, which makes them the size of a Buick, walking around the battlefield, laying waste to everything using horrible psychic powers. Then we get to the Dark Angels, which we call the Emo Space Marines because they are. Okay. And they're pretty cool. Nate plays them. They're neat. We also have Imperial Knights, which are an offshoot of the Astra Militarum, and they're super robots, which I'm sure James is going to get into a lot about the giant super mech robots that the Imperium has.
God machines.
The Militarum Tempestus, that's another faction. These are all playable factions, by the way, with their own,
So wait a minute. Before we go way too far, I would like to cover who else humanity shares the galaxy with.
Right, because this is my thing right now. As an outsider, I'm like, okay, there's a million of us. What the hell are we fighting?
Here. So I've got the full list pulled up. Do you want to just give a rundown on all the guys, and I'll just finish up this list? That way we don't end up jumping back and forth between all of them.
So you need to finish up the Space Marines.
It's not just the Space Marines, man. Okay.
All right. What else we got for humanity?
Okay.
So are you familiar with StarCraft at all?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So StarCraft has a
we won't finish the list.
StarCraft has a bad reputation of, well, some people believe that it's just a straight rip from the 40K universe.
Because it is.
Because you do have your Space Marines, as Mike was talking about. You've got your big insects, what are called the Tyranids. But here's the thing: is that so humanity shares humanity shares the galaxy with a lot of other high fantasy races that are kind of taken to a logical endpoint, nearly 40,000 years into the future. You have your Eldar, which are basically high elves, but think psychic high elves with super advanced science. You have orcs even. Orcs are a strange super fungus that manifests into large orcs.
It's actually a really great part of the lore. The idea behind orcs is once an orc army has invaded a planet, their spores, because they're fungus, spread throughout the planet and hide. And so you'll actually kill this invading orc army, and then 2 decades later, suddenly they're back. They've just popped back out of the ground and are killing everybody again.
It's grody as fuck.
It is, isn't it? They're great.
So, I guess if you want sort of a general history of how the galaxy got to be this way, just give me a red flag or give me a go ahead on that.
You gonna talk about the old ones?
Yes, might as well. All right, so.
Because
here we go.
About the Necrons and the Orcs, and they're supposedly created by the old ones, although we don't actually know that.
It's history time, boys and girls.
This is the really super apocryphal history.
Fable. So you have the galaxy and you have humanity, and humanity is spreading out under a golden age of technology. There's nothing that we can't do. There are no frontiers that we can't cross. And we're just starting to figure out that we're not alone in the universe and that there are other species that we share this galaxy with. Now, around the same time, we've been kind of going around and doing faster than light travel, thanks to this other plane of reality we found that we dubbed the warp. And you just go faster in the warp because the laws of physics don't apply. Now, the problem is that all living things affect the warp. Through our psychic emanations, or just simply by being living creatures on a parallel side of reality.
Well, I thought the Necrons and the Orcs are kind of separate from the warp.
They are.
I mean, that's like the point of the Orcs is that, well, all right, this would get really esoteric. So keep going, sorry.
We're just trying to paint the picture of the poor galaxy as it is. And there's also another species that's horribly advanced, which is the Eldar. And you got to think of them as high elves with tons of technology.
Okay.
Now, to keep it somewhat simple, one of their gods goes insane.
Gods like fantasy gods.
Fantasy
Divine
gods,
being that
actual
creates
real creatures that have an influence on the world. And there are gods of the warp, which sort of... If a species of billions believes in something so strongly, the warp will make it so.
Okay.
And the Eldar got so old that all their problems kind of manifested into a really, really horrible thing that took out most of their homeworlds and created a kind of psychic sinkhole in space covering a star cluster called the Eye of Terror. So they're kind of screwed, and they're a dying civilization. When this is created, it screws up the warp, and it screws up humanity's expansion out into the galaxy. All of these different divergent tribes of men are now cut off from each other, and they're cut off from each other for a good long period of time.
Okay.
Now into this, you get this incredibly powerful super being, and I can talk about his background a lot, but I'm not going to. And he becomes the God Emperor of mankind. He's simply a strategic and charismatic force of such power that he is able to go back out into the galaxy. Once all of this warp storm stuff kind of calms down thousands of years later, he's able to lead crusades back out into space to reclaim the Imperium of Man.
He's essentially post-human. The idea behind him partially is that he's a reincarnation of all living psychics who all died at once to reincarnate themselves as this single being that is supposed to be, in a lot of ways, the next evolutionary step for the human race.
Okay.
So things were going really well on the Crusades. It looked like this was going to be a human-controlled galaxy through the force of mankind, and gosh darn it, we're just good guys. Unfortunately, you have a very kind of like God and Lucifer relationship with the God Emperor and his favored lieutenant, and who's known as Horus. And there is a falling out, and Horus becomes corrupted by the warp. Now, because the warp has become so chaotic, it starts to manifest a force known as chaos. It's so like this other plane of reality is so screwed up, it bleeds into our own reality. Just imagine if we're sitting here and all of a sudden your room just started to become a horror movie.
James, if I may, the four gods of chaos. For those of you who don't know, there are four greater powers of chaos. They are gods in the fact that they are manifestations of sentient beings, sort of like debased natures. So there's Slanesh, who is accidentally created by the Eldar. Slanesh is the hermaphroditic god of pleasure. Most of Slanesh's demon army takes the form of crab-clawed, scorpion-tailed, bare-breasted women with penises.
As one would.
Yes, of course. Then we get on to Khorne the Bloodthirster.
Wait, corn?
Khorne the Bloodthirster.
Corn like the food or the band?
Khorne the Bloodthirster. I'm just going to keep repeating that.
Is it like the band or the food?
Perhaps you could spell
It's
it for them.
spelled Khorne. so neither.
Oh, so they went out of their way to make sure they wouldn't be associated with either Maze or a crappy band.
And they are actually, it predates Korn, the shitty band.
That's good.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. But
They planned ahead.
Korn is the god, obviously, of bloodthirsting and blood rage and anger and wrath. And he sits on a giant throne of skulls, way off there, and bronze and shit. And as the saying goes, blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne, as is his due.
Sure.
So obviously,
That's
then there's
what I always
grandfather.
say.
Yeah. Then there's grandfather Nurgle, who's
Wait a minute. Grandfather Nurgle.
yeah. Doesn't that sound nice, James? Can you pull up a picture of Nurgle just to show him?
So we can get
'Cause
the
he's my
auditory
favorite
reaction.
looking
I'm going to
animal.
say, between the first two, they have pretty godly, like even Korn, that's pretty abrasive, especially with the, blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. That's a good aggressive. Grandfather Nurgle sounds a little bit like the Peavy guy who lives at the end of the road that kids aren't allowed to
Behold
play around.
that wonderful elder god and all of his nastiness.
But apparently he's just mostly stomachs in the form of a man with a really hideous face and horns. Okay.
He's the god of disease and pestilence, and he rewards his followers by infecting them with horrible diseases that make them mutant monsters, which they are then expected to spread as plagues throughout the galaxy.
I see. Now I see in any way connected to the fungal orcs.
No,
Okay.
he is not.
Okay.
The orcs are not part of chaos.
So we're not there yet.
We are
so
not
who's the
there yet.
fourth chaotic god?
Tzeentch! So yeah, Tzeentch, the Lord of Change. He's the god of mutation and essentially psychic magic and its ability to malform things. He's pretty cool. He's pretty badass. He's one of my favorite. He's the patron god of the Thousand Suns, which is a pretty cool chapter for the traitor Marines who should all burn in hell.
So this pantheon of evil gods, they are our principal adversary in this world?
I mean, they're also
If everybody was
kind
smart,
of good guys.
They would be.
In a way.
But we kind of can't stop killing all the different species. We end up killing each other for a lot of really stupid reasons.
So they're also exploiting.
And the
fighting.
chaos gods laugh.
Right.
So from the point of view of chaos, if you are a chaos or a chaos space marine, you see what they call the corpse emperor, which of course the rest of the Imperium refers as the god emperor, as a false idol who has led humanity astray and enslaved them. And they were then themselves freed by chaos, because chaos is this pure will of like emotion and debased energy and true humanity that made them better than themselves by giving them horrible powers and expecting, terrible tolls of death in return.
Whereas the other guys
Are super space fascists crushing any opposition under their heel.
Okay.
Unfortunately, this is pretty true.
Neither of them are good. There are no good guys.
So here's my thing. This is like novels of knowledge retained in your heads about this. You guys adore this world.
Yes.
Everyone I've ever met who plays Warhammer, obviously, is not just enthusiastic about it. They are all like you.
Yes.
Everyone I've ever met who plays this game knows more about it. Like, this is coming as somebody who adores the world of Warcraft, and even to a lesser degree, Blizzard's other properties. I know pretty much everything about Warcraft lore I could. And it's not in the same way of, like, the almost religious dedication to understanding the lore.
I'm not really appreciating how you're questioning our religion. I think we should report him to the Inquisition. I think you need to be taken away by the black ships. I think it's time. So maybe you should stop.
Come on, we could just let the local commissar deal with them.
We could. Show him
Wham
the head.
bam, thank you, ma'am.
How did you guys fall down this rabbit hole? How'd you get into this world, or miniature gaming, or the hybrid of thereof?
Well, see, I didn't even tumble down the regular rabbit hole, which, Mike came in right as, tabletop gaming and being very enthusiastic about it, and the sort of level of involvement. It's one of the things why you get so excited about the lore, is because there is so much, and it's constantly growing and expanding in different ways. I got into it through a series of novels by one of my favorite authors, Dan Abnett. And if you're not familiar with him, the new Guardians of the Galaxy movie is based off of his run writing the Guardian of the Galaxy comics. So this is kind of the kind of caliber that this guy is. And he's been working with the Black Library, which is the Games Workshop's sort of production house. And
Publishing, yeah.
for publishing
Novels and such.
And it's one of the things where like they don't I don't think they have a deal with Amazon yet or something like that, because their authors kind of like working under their umbrella. But anyways, I'm getting off track. So this was a whole series of books, and I don't know if anybody likes the BBC and likes Sean Bean and Sharp's Rifles, but he wrote a series of novels in the 40K universe that hums very similarly to that, and it's called Gaunt's Ghosts, and it's about sort of regular, everyday guys who are part of the Imperial Guard, and you heard how they're treated in the 40K universe.
Bullet sponges, you know.
You know, and that's how they're thought of. They're just simply swept up wholesale in the founding of regiments and thrown against all the enemies of mankind, because it is not for them to ask how they give their life for the Emperor, it's how they give their death. This is the world that they live in. And I was fascinated by the story of just regular everyday guys who've been pushed far beyond the limits of what you'd ever ask anybody, going out and doing the heroic 40K thing against a universe that is actively trying to murder them almost all the time.
All right.
For me, it was through tabletop gaming. I started playing originally Warhammer Fantasy Battles, which is their other game, which focuses on fantasy battles.
Sure.
I had 2 armies. I had my greenskins, which are the orcs and goblins, and then I had the dwarves. So I played those for a long time, sticking to fantasy. But obviously going to hobby shops and playing Warhammer Fantasy and subsequently Hordes and War Machines, which are an entire other company's tabletop offering, as there are many, I ended up having a lot of friends and acquaintances who played 40K, because 40K is the bigger game. More people play 40K, even though it came later. It's the younger sibling, but it's way more popular.
Right.
Because it's fucking badass, and you get the Space Marines and shit. But so I ended up playing a game called Space Hulk, which is a video game, and I ended up going into the shop, and, you know, it'd be a slow day, and someone would be like, you know, Mike, do you want to play some 40K? Yeah, here, borrow my army. You know how to play a tabletop game, so I'd borrow my friends like Necrons or Imperial Guard, or just get to play. It wasn't until very recently that I actually finally got my own 40K army, because, as we mentioned, it is a very big investment, and I already invested in 3 games, 4 armies between them, and I was able to start my Blood Angels chapter. And for those of you who are in the know and listening to this, which is probably no one, I play a pretty standard Blood Angels army, jump infantry heavy, lots of death company, and I use Devastator squads and whirlwinds to back me up with big heavy artillery pieces that I can start on the board and then deep strike with the rest of my army.
See, the thing is to try and just simplify it a little bit, I think where the draw and the attraction from this universe comes from is, one, it's a huge megalomania fix. If you're interested in things in large scale, or if you like history, or you ever played with army men as a kid, this is the logical progression of army men, except with rules and systems and a whole bunch of other stuff that you can get very, very involved in. The other thing, too, is the strange kind of almost Lovecraftian allure of the universe, that it's familiar. There was one guy who was talking about the universe itself, and he said that part of its draw is that it's both familiar and alien. So you're dealing with all these classic fantasy tropes, i.e. the familiar, and it's in a universe that, I mean, H.P. Lovecraft would have adored. He would have been like, oh, you guys have your own elder gods. Yay!
Yeah, we're supposed to talk about the Elder Ones at some point, too.
Well, so for me, this has been my interesting relationship with it. I think the first time I ever saw anything about this, and I can't say whether it was Warhammer specifically or a different miniatures game, but the first time I remember encountering it was the first time I ever went to a gaming convention, which was a small one in Plymouth, New Hampshire, where I grew up. It was this college-run one at Plymouth State University called EconoCon. I was there principally playing Dungeons and Dragons and Magic cards, because that was what I was into at that point. That was what I was going with. But I remember at the conventions, they just have these tables set up with like the magazines that sold the miniatures, which all seem to be owned by the companies that produce them.
Yep.
And then just the, shelves and glass cabinets and all sorts of things set up with hundreds of these little guys. And you walk up and look at them, and I remember at first being fascinated by the fact that they had all these miniature characters and wanting to like instantly start buying them up and just like owning them because they were cool little like things. And then at once being completely overwhelmed and intimidated by, one, the lore that was involved in it, because there was always some guy sitting behind the desk who was like, no, you wouldn't want to buy that one. He's not the right unit for a beginner.
There are lots of gatekeeper douchebags in this community.
And then you'd pick up this little box of like 6 little pewter or plastic men, and you'd be like, yes, I want to buy them. These look great. And they'd be like, well, that's going to be $38. Like, whoa, buddy.
It is a very steep entrance fee.
Yeah.
And time commitment.
The thing is that I guess for people who get the most out of it, it was when I sat down and I actually first did like a few squads, and it was at the main mall, and they had one of those gaming kiosks, and they just set it up so that they would have a squad of Chaos Space Marines, and you'd have a squad of Ultramarines, and they'd be like, do you know about 40K? No, I don't. Well, do you want to play around? Cool. And so you're sitting there and you're moving little guys around on a very nice felt table with some interesting landscape and whatnot. And given a turn and how much your units can move and given their abilities, you have to figure out a way to tactically and strategically meet the enemy, overwhelm, and defeat them based on a series of rules that make a whole lot of sense if you're doing army guys from straight down on tabletop. And so sure, maybe it's not for everybody, and maybe the guy let me win, but there was a part of me that felt very satisfied at a very young and enthusiastic level for having my grenade land just right and having them retreat away from it directly into my guy with the flamethrower. And just the fact that, you're not winning because, you spent a lot of money on it, because it's yes, people will spend a lot of money on it, but the way that the point system is set up, it's not that.
Well, there's going to be another question I ask: is cash investment equate to an advantage in balance?
All right, so this gets a little complicated. You can play games of any size. You can seriously put down $50 and play 100 games with that $50. They would just be very small skirmish games. I'm going to say straight up, I cheat. I never buy anything direct from Games Workshop because they gouge the shit out of you. I go onto eBay or other points of the internet and I'm like, oh, 20% off here. I'm going to take that and I'm going to take that. And this is going to save me $50. So I go about it, I'd say the smart way. I'd be upset for not directly supporting Games Workshop, but I am going to be honest. If you guys are listening, you guys do fuck up a lot, and you're kind of assholes. But I love your game.
Sure.
Yeah. So I really, and plus I always buy those fucking $50 books that you guys charge me for, you pieces of shit. They don't have to be that expensive. But yeah, it is a big money investment, and yes, spending a lot of money can get you more units. It'll give you more options. But most people or most games are run at what's an 1850 point value, which probably doesn't mean anything. But let's say I have a regular foot soldier, depending on which army you're playing, can be anywhere between 6 and 40 points, depending on how good they are.
So 1840 is like a point cap on the resources you can use for
exactly. That game. So that's what you get to field with. Spending more money can get you more units. Certain units work better against certain armies with better strategies and synergy. And you realize that really one of the biggest points of strategy is making your army list, making it balanced, making sure that you're bringing the right enemies or right soldiers to bear against the right forces. For example, I play predominantly with my friend Nate, who runs a few different armies, but his main army is the Tau. The Tau are like crazy space communist kind of good guys who come from the eastern fringe of the galaxy and were supposedly genetically modified by the Eldar to like get super advanced technology within the span of just a couple thousand years, that they could then go fight against the Imperium and spread across the stars and spread their message of like for the greater good, which is about cooperation. And they're like the only faction that when they encounter other races don't immediately kill them. Instead they try to like convert them to their way to see that we're all brothers and it's all for the greater good and we can work together, which of course pisses off the Imperium, and then they send in the Space Marines. But I play Blood Angels that I mentioned earlier, which is a very high point cost army. One of his average troopers might be 10 to 12 points. I have, like I mentioned, my Death Company earlier with their jetpacks come out to be 40 points apiece as like a regular troop choice. But how my army works is they're an assault army and they're a deep strike army, which means they descend from the sky into the battlefield subsequently in turns as the game goes on, so I have reinforcements, and eat people alive in melee combat.
See, that kind of synergy, that's something that really appeals to me, especially as a Magic player. The idea that you construct a deck within a certain set of rules. In this case, it would be like points limits for that, but for this, it would be the game type you're playing in, standard, legacy, whatever. And then you use as much as you can within those rules to get you as far as you can.
Yes.
The flip side of that was the main reason I burned out on Magic was the cash investment. That is a game where balance is proportionately affected within each play type by the amount of money you have. And particularly for somebody like me who was playing standard, you were constantly reinvesting in new cards in order to stay anywhere near having a fighting chance at, even like a casual level.
Yeah.
And that was something that got frustrating for me. But the weird thing that I think it is in contrast to Warhammer, which for my mind probably is a stiffer cash investment, you seem to get more longevity out of it. I know like most of the people I know have pieces that they use that are very old that are still, applicable within the current rule set. And they stay invested in the game. Like, because they have less opportunity to play it, because it involves more setup and the community's smaller, it almost seems like they get more out of that money that they invest in.
You totally do. And if you play regularly, once you've built yourself, once you have about 1,850 to 2,500 points, you can just play with that army for years. If you don't want to, if you have an army that works for you, if you like your army list, you never have to buy another model again. It's not like Magic where you're constantly having to buy the new cards that are coming out to stay competitive. There's an advantage, like, I know James has a lot to say about something called the Bane Blade, which is a super giant tank, which the individual model costs, I think it's $125.
Usually, at least, because they're so rare and people buy them up.
Yeah.
Because this was a super heavy tank constructed by the Tech Priests of Mars.
Fuck yeah!
And with the sole purpose of overwhelming the enemy through intimidation and sheer firepower.
It's a tank that, like, I know I'm trying to think of something relative. Like, if you were to turn around right now and look across the street, you see where the two houses are next door? Both of those houses are a little bit smaller than a Bane Blade.
Wow.
It's a giant tank.
One of the best descriptions that I think that I heard or that I read Dan Abnett make about it is that it's so large that its engine note is down at the level of some of the predators that we used to have ages ago. Because the human species, when it hears a sound at a certain decibel level, triggers a flight or fight response, because that means that something big is kind of going, hungry. And they designed the tank to make a noise that triggers the human flight or fright,
Wow.
So I kind of fell in love with it a little bit, being a huge fan of firepower. But just to talk about the models, you definitely get the impression that even though the models do cost a lot, it's not so much, you've got to have this specific thing. It's two guys getting together with their armies and having a good time. It's not so much that, you've got to buy a new unit to keep up with them. I know I overheard Mike a couple of times during his recent painting process where he would just be like, okay, well, this guy is going to be my this. And, just so long as you're agreed upon on the rules. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to play Warhammer 40K with little togs or say like a marker cap or something like that. Well, I've got a Lord Commander, but he got broken, so I've got a marker cap, and that's going to be my Lord Commander. And somebody be like, okay, wait, do you actually have a Lord Commander? See, he's broken twain. Okay, you can use the marker cap.
Right.
And it's just not that important. What's important is what's actually going on there. And you'll have some guys who, when they sit down to play a game, it's like they're the herald for the regiment. This is the Marigold 57th, the victors of Talendu, the slayers of the Eldar, quake and fear, that kind of thing. Because
totally
that's what's important, is that you get all worked up and overblown and crazy about it, and so that you're frothing at the mouth a little bit.
Well, that's another thing too. So I've watched some games with miniatures, and I always thought this was an interesting switch. When you play a standard strategy board game, like you're playing something, this is a crappy example, but like Risk, or like I don't know, like Risk. We'll use it as a bad example. when you play a game, you're not really that behind your guys. Like even if you have a big horde of like little cannon men or whatever, you're just rolling dice, and you're more pissed at the other people on the board or invested in yourself as the winner than you are thinking about I'm the commander of.
There's no nationalistic fervor of being I am the commander of sort of Northern Europe and a little bit of Asia.
Right, like you don't get that kind of investment, but literally every time I've seen a battle of miniatures, they're talking as if they're one of like the men on the field or the guy commanding them, and they keep that element of roleplay in it. Like even in a loss, there's like that kind of like, we were crushed here in the valley of so-and-so, murdered to the last man.
And one thing that is very interesting that Games Workshop will do is that they'll have these guys out there planning these big games, and they'll go, hey, you know, if you guys are doing, if you're doing this game, why don't we have it decide the lore of the universe?
Oh, wow.
You know, just the whole kind of like, we wanted to do a battle between space bugs and space marines. So when you guys have it out, tell us how it went, you know, like keep a little video log of it and tell us who won. And then that will be what happened at the battle of so-and-so.
So they use those to drive the cannon.
Yes, they do. It is in a lot of instances player driven, which is really neat. They've been doing it for years. They do it also for Warhammer Fantasy. But I know we have been rambling on a lot about chaos and the Imperium and the esoterics of the rules and the hobby, but we should give a shout out to all the Xeno races that we don't give a shit about because we don't play them. But just so that everybody has a quick breakdown, there are the Eldar and the Dark Eldar, which are space elves and dark space elves.
Okay.
In the case of the Dark Eldar, they're really dark BDSM space elves, which is neat.
They have to torture people or their god eats their soul.
50
Yeah,
Shades
they
of
will.
Drow. All right.
They will like literally cease to exist if they don't like take out like pain on other people. But then breaking down, there's also the Necrons, which I don't know if we're actually going to get to talking about the old ones.
It's pretty quick. You can do it as a poor sob story for the poor
They
things.
sound like undead things.
They are.
Kinda.
It was this poor species, and I think they were facing extinction or something like that.
Well, there was the Necron tier.
So this big evil force came along and said, "Hey, you guys worried about it? All you have to do is serve me, and I'll make sure you guys, you know, are taken care of. You'll live forever. Your species will go on." They didn't know it was the classic devil's bargain, and that they were going to live on as undead cybernetic organisms that can't really be killed.
They're basically like T1 or T2 Terminator skeleton suits that have the souls of this race trapped inside of their metal shells to propel forward like these horrible, ancient, near godlike, crazy inside of star dwelling super spirits.
So, you know, if they go out and perform enough murder and, you know, eventually get to the point where they can bring these evil things into our reality, which will probably end everything as we know it, then maybe they get their original bodies back.
Yep, and according to the Gospel of Lore, they were created to fight the Old Ones, which is a precursor race which has apparently disappeared from the galaxy, but created supposedly the Eldar back in the day, but also created the Orcs, which we talked about earlier. They're crazy space orc fungus. They're really they're space thugs, but their thing is the Orcs aren't connected to the warp. They aren't susceptible to that power, but they have their own collective psychic power. And like James was discussing earlier, how the warp responds is if enough sentient creatures believe in something, like the warp will manifest it. The Orcs essentially have that, but within the realms of regular physics. So if enough Orcs believe something will work, like Orcs collectively believe if you paint something yellow, it will go faster. When they paint things yellow, they actually go faster. It's like a superpower magic type thing with them. Okay. And there's this actual conjecture. So there's what's called the God Emperor, which we discussed earlier, who's currently stuck in an undead stasis attached to this giant machine called the Golden Throne on Terra, Earth. But there's this theory being tossed around by a lot of people in the lore. The only reason that he actually hasn't died is because the Orcs believe that he's alive, so he will continue to be alive because the Orcs believe that he's alive.
I like that.
Yes.
That's like R.I.P. Terry Pratchett. You had a literary causality.
Yes.
If you write something or you say something, then it's true.
Yes, exactly. Oh, man. Terry Pratchett. Wait, everybody, moment of silence.
Moment of silence for Terry Pratchett.
Yeah, it sucks.
It's called Mort. Okay. Anyways, Then there's the Tau we talked about a bit, and then the Tyranids. That's the only one left that we didn't mention, right? The Tyranids are crazy space bugs. They're who the Zerg are based on.
Okay.
I'm saying that as fact because it is.
Well, yeah, I don't think even Blizzard disputes that the origins of their game worlds come out of Warhammer.
They ripped off the Tyranids, but the Tyranids were also kind of ripped off from the Xenos, or Xenomorphs, whatever. But they're crazy intergalactic, not interstellar, but intergalactic space bugs that came from some other galaxy, have essentially an unknown origin, horrendous psychic powers, and are these giant hive minds that arrive in planets with these huge Leviathan ships, send down spore pods full of crazy bugs to kill everything that could resist on the planet, and then from space drop miles long, like, gross sucker tentacles to absorb all living matter on the planet until it's a barren rock.
Oh, and you forgot to mention that the little things that they drop to begin with, they go around and they initially meet resistance. So they eat the resistance, and any attributes or strengths that the resistance had, they now have. They're called gene stealers.
Yes.
And so if you were like, oh, Space Marine, go kill the space bugs eat the Space Marine, now they're about as strong and as fast as a Space Marine, and also they chowed down on his armor too, so they got stronger.
Just like ants or bees, they have, the different casts like drones and
Just like
soldiers.
Ants. Kids, don't ever fight ants. They will steal your genes, become more powerful.
But unlike
and there's some
ants,
there's some future there's some future 40K player out there who's gonna go out to an anthill and be like, I'm gonna get a start on you guys now.
There's they develop different types of drones.
I also love how we occasionally surmise children listen to this podcast. They don't.
Please don't. If you are a child and you are listening to us, fuck off. This is not appropriate.
Which is probably encouraging you to keep going.
Bastards.
Yeah. Man. Yeah, I mean, I guess with me, the thing is, too, is it's such a deep universe, it feels like it has that gate on it. Like, this is a big commitment. People always need that friend who brings them into it. I think both of you had that story where you met somebody who made it accessible to you and was like your Sherpa into the lore of this world.
Here I am. I feel like one of Dan Abnett's press agents here. But I mean, you can get yourself a cheap paperback copy if you're a reader. If you like them books. Jeez, analog, right? Huh. But Dan Abnett's books of Gaunt's Ghosts, they're just sort of a great kind of army story. Lots of big battles, lots of very interesting and diverse characters, and it all is taking place against the backdrop of the 40K universe and can give you, sort of hold your hand as you walk through the artillery shell blasted minefield, because you're with the Tanith first and they're good company. The other thing was, I can't imagine that the Dawn of War games are very expensive currently. I mean, because they were released a while ago. And I got to admit, if you're looking for something to help give you a good scale, it's a game, I wouldn't say comparable. Well,
it's a really good RTS.
It's a really good RTS. And when you take it to the big blown out conclusion, you're going to slow down any computer with the amount of kabooms you have going on. If you want to have any fun, that is.
Additionally, you also don't have to be invested in the lore. I know I have a friend who was a Necron player. He actually doesn't play anymore, but he knows nothing about the lore.
That's a good point.
He just liked the game. If you legitimately just want to play like a cool tabletop strategy game, it's one of the best. It's extremely well balanced. The gameplay is exceptional.
Mike, could it just be us? Could we just be nerds?
Well, and this is my summation here. So the other theme in my life with Warhammer enthusiasts has been the call out, which we've heard even here, that Blizzard has sniped their everything,
which is fair,
and remade it, which is 100% true. But I dare say the people at Blizzard may have found a way to make this kind of world far more accessible.
Yeah, they focus straight on the battles, which is what Warhammer 40K was trying to do, which was just get to the shooty.
Well, and I think it's an excellent distillation because, so there's a lot of interest in the lore that the Imperium of Man is divided into all of these factions with these various goals, and they have this long history that goes back to all these things like that. But for a game like StarCraft, for it to work just as a video game, they said, no, 3 races. There, I guess, are technically 2 factions of humanity in StarCraft, but really, by the point it is now, that doesn't even matter.
And they constantly funnel the story in where the factions, you're either in direct opposition with them or, you're working together with your factions because of bigger story elements.
Yeah.
They don't sit there and say, oh, well, everything is kerfucked, have fun.
Well, and I would say, too, is like a real-time strategy, Warcraft back in the day, one of the things that has always, for me, stood out about that game compared to every other RTS I've ever played, in all of its iterations, Warcraft 1, 2, 3, and up through StarCraft, it is the simplest of the RTSs to learn on computers and always by far the hardest to master. They just manage to take it and say you can learn it in a day, and mastering it will take you years, and you will always meet players who have found new and interesting ways to make that game work.
All the time.
I think the source of this, though, the source material, Warhammer, is something very similar in a tabletop game. It sounds like it's one of those things where you were talking about just an afternoon in the mall was enough to get you that first moment of joy, the grenade moment where you're like, yeah, my plan worked. I understood what was going on. And then how many more years could you spend reading the novels, playing the games, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a really interesting game. I think it's odd, too, that I never fell into it.
Well, this is what's going to happen. Nate's going to come back from his business trip, and he has multiple armies, and I have an army, and you're going to play.
All right, well, there we go. Then maybe this is the beginning.
And that is one thing that
I know
you
my
will
wife
find.
would appreciate that. She likes painting the miniatures.
Yeah.
Danny's all about the
She's
crafting.
probably
of
way
them.
better at it than I am. I actually got to get back on that horse and finish painting out all my regiments. They take so long.
One thing I can say about the Warhammer 40K community is just the fact that, you may get your snobs, you may... What did you call them? The gatekeepers? Yeah, the gatekeepers.
Smelly, gross, Wendy's cheeseburger stain gatekeepers.
But still,
The hands of Baconator.
the simple fact of the matter is that usually what your average Warhammer 40K player is looking for is just somebody else who wants to play the game, because it's it brings them a lot of enjoyment, and we all try to forget people who maybe they just sort of feel uncomfortable about how interested they are in this, so they get defensive about things.
I will
but
say,
it's just the fact that everybody wants to sit down and lead an army to glory and victory.
I would say most 40K players I've met are very friendly people.
Yeah.
I have trashed on the gatekeepers a little bit because they are out there and they can be problematic. And you know what? Some of you legitimately are bad for the community and you scare other players away.
But any community has people like that.
Yes. Especially in our nerdy communities. And it can be very misogynistic, and you make me a little upset. But the majority of 40K players I found are just like goofy dads and art school dropouts and engineers who like want to play cool nerdy war games in the weekends.
I would encourage anybody out there, too, if you guys haven't checked out hobby gaming like this, craft gaming, like basically wargaming with tables where they build these things, go see it. Even if it's not something you don't want to play, this is something you need to see. I would say you have no idea what it's like until you see 8 people who could give a shit whether you're in the room or not playing it, and then you get the real deal. These are grown-ass men who invest a lot of time into a hobby that hybridizes a million different skills and talents and is a totally rad game. It's something worth checking out. Let us know if you guys are down with the Warhammer, if you like miniature gaming, or if you have no idea what any of this was and you think that James and Mike are in a cult. I think that could possibly be the net effect of this episode. Either way, you can find us on YouTube, as you have been. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook. We post to iTunes and SoundCloud.
Forgot the fucking Space Wolves!